The wind in Wyoming territory did not whisper. In the winter of 1889, it howled, a hollow sound that seemed to come from the frozen iron of the rails themselves. Copper Butte Station was less a town than a scar on the flat. White expanse. It was a place to get off the train, or to get on it, or to freeze to death, waiting for one. The air was thick with coal smoke and the metallic bite of coming snow. From the single platform, you could see the whole of the settlement, a raw lumber hotel with a sagging porch, a general store whose windows were opaque with frost, and a saloon already loud, though it was barely afternoon. A few men, shapeless in heavy coats, moved between the buildings. They were miners with the gray dust of the earth ground into their skin, cowboys whose faces were chapped raw, and the occasional quiet man with a gun on his hip who watched the train arrive with a professional stillness. Above the din of the wind and the hissing locomotive, a small bell chimed relentlessly. It was the preacher, standing on the steps of his tiny, unpainted church, trying to call a congregation that was not listening. Abigail Quinn stepped down from the passenger car onto the icy planks. The wind immediately attacked her, pulling at the wool of her coat and snapping at the edges of the magnificent beaded shawl she wore draped over her shoulders. The shawl, with its intricate patterns of blue and white, had been her mother's. It was a piece of the Cheyenne world she carried with her, just as she carried the stern set of her jaw from her Scottish blacksmith father in her worn reticule. She carried two things of value: a small, tin-type photograph of a smiling man named Silas Reed, and 67 cents. She scanned the platform. The few men waiting were strangers. No one stepped forward. No one smiled in recognition. The man in the photograph, the one who had written of a small ranch and a new life, was not there. Abigail, Abby, she corrected herself, had been told she was unwanted before. Her entire life had been a negotiation between her two halves. Too Scottish for her mother's people, far too Cheyenne for the white world. But this was a new, colder kind of rejection. This was abandonment at the end of the line. She pulled the shawl tighter. She would not panic. She would be practical. She approached the station master, a thin man with a drooping mustache who was nervously checking his pocket watch against the station clock. He saw her coming and his face fell. He knew who she was. "Excuse me, sir, I am looking for Mr. Silas Reed. He was meant to meet me." The station master, a Mr. Tibbs, took off his hat and wiped a hand over his bald head, though the air was freezing. He looked past her shoulder, at the mountains, at the saloon, at anything but her face. Miss Quinn, yes, I was afraid of this. There has been a situation." A situation. The word hung in the air, cold and small. "Mr. Reed is not here, ma'am. He was detained." Detained. Abby felt the platform shift slightly beneath her feet. Detained where? "He was arrested. Miss, 2 nights ago. Sheriff Hale took him in." Arrested. The photograph in her bag seemed to grow heavy. Silas, with his kind eyes and promises of a home. What could he have done? The station master leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though the wind snatched the words away. "They say it was cattle rustling, ma'am, stealing from Baron Luther Pike." He said the last name as if it were a curse. Luther Pike. The name meant nothing to Abby, but the station master's fear, and the sudden, predatory interest from a group of miners idling by the baggage car, told her it meant everything in Copper Butte. "She is a half-breed," one of the miners said, his voice loud enough to carry. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow near her feet. Another man laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "What is Pike's property doing all the way out here? Maybe she is Silas's payment." Abby turned. Her father had taught her how to swing a hammer, and he had taught her how to stand. She did not speak. She simply looked at the men, her eyes as flat and cold as the landscape. She held their gaze until the laughter faltered, until they shuffled and looked away. Grumbling, she had kept her dignity. But the station master's next words stole it right back. "I am sorry, Miss Quinn, truly. But Sheriff Hale, he is very close with Baron Pike. It does not look good for Silas. Not good at all." The train whistle shrieked, a final, mournful sound. The locomotive began to chug, great white clouds of steam billowing back over the platform, shrouding the jeering miners. And then it was gone, moving east, leaving Abby alone with 67 cents, a photograph of a man in jail, and a sky that was turning a deep, bruised purple. "A snowstorm, not just a flurry, but a real blizzard." The preacher's bell stopped ringing, cut off as the man finally retreated indoors. The world seemed to hold its breath. Abby stood frozen. She could not afford the hotel. She could not go back. She had no home, no fiancé, and in a few hours, she might not even have shelter. The panic she had held back now rose in her throat, hot and suffocating. She was unwanted. She was abandoned. She was trapped. Then she heard it. It was not the wind. It was a sound almost too small for the vastness of the territory. A thin, reedy cry, like a kitten. It was coming from behind a stack of barrels and a large baggage car waiting to be unloaded. Abby moved on instinct. She walked past the barrels, into the alley of snow formed between the station wall and the freight car. There, huddled against the unfeeling wood, was a small child. It was a little girl, perhaps 5 years old, with hair the color of dry flax. She was shivering violently, her lips blue. Her small hands, raw with cold, were clutching a filthy, ragged cloth doll with button eyes. She was alone, lost, and burning with fever. When Abby touched the child's forehead, the heat was alarming. The girl looked up, her eyes unfocused and bright. She was not crying loudly, just a continuous, hopeless whimper. "Hello there," Abby said, her own voice rough. "Where is your papa? Where is your mother?" The child just shivered, burrowing her face into the doll. Abby's own problems evaporated. This was not an abstract crisis of finance and futures. This was a child dying in the snow. She quickly unwrapped the heavy Cheyenne shawl from her own shoulders and wrapped it around the girl, tucking it tightly. The girl was small, weighing almost nothing. Abby lifted her, cradling her against her own coat. The child's shivering eased slightly as she soaked up Abby's warmth. Abby rubbed the girl's back, whispering nonsense. "It is all right. You are safe now. We will find your papa." The child tipped her head back, her eyes clearing for just a moment. She stared up at Abby's face, at the dark hair and the unfamiliar features. She seemed to study her. Then, in a voice so quiet it was barely louder than the snow falling, the child whispered the words that broke the last of Abby's composure. "Can I keep you, Mommy?" Abby's breath hitched. A sob, hot and painful, tore from her chest. Tears welled and froze instantly on her eyelashes. She, who had just been discarded, who had no one, was being claimed by a feverish, lost child. She hugged the girl tight, burying her face in the flaxen hair, and wept for all of it. The failed journey, the empty platform, the cruel words, and this devastatingly innocent request. "June." The voice was a roar, a man's voice, sharp with terror. "June, where are you?" A man burst around the corner of the freight car, his chest heaving. He was tall, dressed in a heavy sheepskin coat, and his face was stark with panic. He stopped dead when he saw Abby holding his daughter. Relief washed over his features, so profound it made him sag. But it was followed instantly by something else: suspicion, wariness. His eyes took in Abby, the dark hair, the high cheekbones, the edge of the beadwork on the shawl now wrapped around his child. He did not look like the man in the photograph. He was harder, broader, his eyes holding a shadow Silas's lacked. He stepped forward slowly, his hands held half open. "I am Eli Reed. That is my daughter." Abby nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She held the child, June, out to him. Eli Reed took his daughter, his movements sure and gentle. He cradled her against his chest, his large hand swallowing her head as he checked her temperature. He looked at Abby, his gaze assessing, guarded. "Silas Reed is my brother." He said it flatly, an explanation that was also a question. I am Abigail Quinn. I came to marry Silas." Eli's expression did not change, but a flicker of understanding, and perhaps pity, passed through his eyes. He knew. Of course he knew. He also knew his brother was in jail. He turned his attention back to June. "She is burning up. I turned my back for 1 minute to load the sleigh, and she wandered off." He looked back at Abby, his voice formal, polite, but deeply remote. "My wife, her mother, was Comanche. This town, it is not kind. I am wary when she is out of my sight." He was explaining his suspicion. He was telling her that he understood the world she had just stepped into. The wind screamed, and the snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet. The station, 10 yards away, became a faint outline. The storm was here. Eli Reed looked at the sky, he looked at the shivering child in his arms, and he looked at Abby, standing alone, her shawl gone, the snow already collecting on her shoulders. He was a practical man. She could not stay here. "Ma'am," he said. His voice clipped. "This is a blizzard. You cannot stay here. The hotel will be full of Pike's men, and they are not refined." Abby just nodded, numb. "My ranch, Willow Draw. It is not far. You can take shelter there. For 1 night." He added the last part quickly. "Just for the night. Tomorrow, when this breaks, we will sort out this business with Silas." It was not an invitation. It was a solution to an immediate problem, like finding a leak in a roof. Abby had no other choice. To refuse was to die. "I accept," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." From the window of the station master's office, a figure watched them. A man in a long, dark coat with a silver star pinned to it. Sheriff Hale. He saw the tall rancher, the woman of mixed heritage, and the child. He watched them move toward a large sleigh hidden behind the station. The sheriff pulled a small notebook from his pocket, wrote something down, and then tapped on the glass. One of the miners who had harassed Abby looked over. The sheriff gestured. A sharp, subtle motion. The man nodded, his eyes fixed on Abby's back as she walked away. The sleigh was sturdy, built for hauling feed, not for comfort. Eli settled June between them, cocooning her in a thick bison hide. He untied the horses, and with a click of his tongue, they moved out into the white. The world dissolved. There was only the sound of the sleigh runners and the howl of the wind. They sat in silence for a long time, 3 strangers bound by a storm. June, tucked between the 2 adults, surrounded by the bison hide and her mother's shawl, began to warm up. Her shivering subsided. She stirred, her eyes opening. She looked at Eli, then turned her head to look at Abby. She seemed more lucid now, the fever receding slightly in the dry cold. She studied Abby with a solemn, 5-year-old intensity. Then her small voice piped up, clear and inquisitive, cutting through the storm. "Do you know how to make biscuits?" Abby startled. She looked at the small, serious face after the day she had endured. The question was so normal, so rooted in the realities of home and hearth, that it was a lifeline. A small smile, the first genuine smile she had felt in months, touched her lips. She looked at June. "If there is flour, and there is an oven, and there is a good little girl, I will consider it." June nodded, apparently satisfied with this legal arrangement. She closed her eyes and snuggled deeper into the robes. Beside her, Eli Reed kept his eyes on the barely visible trail, his face unreadable in the gray. Flying snow, but Abby thought she saw the corner of his hard mouth twitch, just for a second, before the wind stole the moment away. The world outside the sleigh was a formless, roaring white, but the ranch called Willow Draw appeared out of the blizzard like a memory. It was not grand. A long, low cabin of dark, weathered logs sat hunkered against the wind. A curl of smoke from its stone chimney, the only sign of defiance against the storm. Beyond it, the shapes of a barn and a few outbuildings were faint gray ghosts. A section of the pole fence leading to the corral was down, the posts leaning at a desperate angle, already half buried in drifting snow. It was a place that was holding on, not thriving. Yet, when Eli Reed pushed open the heavy plank door, a wave of warmth washed over them. The air inside smelled of burning pine, tallow candles, and old wool. A great stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting a dancing, golden light over the simple room. It was a single space, serving as kitchen, living area, and, behind a curtain, a sleeping quarter. The furniture was handmade and scarred with use. A rifle rested on pegs above the mantelpiece. It was a man's home, sparse and practical, yet the fire made it a haven. The cabin was not a fortress. It was an anchor, holding fast against the inhuman rage of the weather. It felt more like a home than any place Abby had been in years. Eli laid June on a simple rope bed near the hearth, peeling away the layers of bison hide and Abby's shawl. The child's cheeks were flushed a dangerous red, and her breathing was shallow. She whimpered, lost in the fever's grip. "The doctor is a day's ride, and not in this," Eli said, his voice low and rough with worry. He stood helpless, a large, capable man made powerless by a child's illness. Abby did not hesitate. She moved to the fire, warming her numb hands. "Do you have yarrow, elderflower, even peppermint?" Eli stared at her. His late wife had kept a tin of dried herbs, but he had not known what they were for. He pointed to a small wooden box on a high shelf. "In there, I think." Abby found them, her fingers recognizing the brittle leaves and dried white blossoms by touch and scent. These were her mother's tools. She took a kettle from the hook over the fire, filled it with water from a bucket, and set it to boil. She worked with a quiet competence that filled the small cabin. She crushed the herbs, her movements precise, her face calm. This was a language she understood. Eli watched, his suspicion warring with a desperate hope. He saw not a half-breed stranger, but a woman who knew what she was doing. He saw the same practical grace his wife had possessed. He did not question her methods or mock the old ways. He simply stood back, his hands clenched, and let her work. She steeped the herbs into a fragrant tea, cooled it with a little snow from a pail by the door, and then gently coaxed the warm liquid past June's lips. She dipped a cloth in cool water and laid it on the child's forehead. She sat by the bed, humming a low, wordless Cheyenne lullaby, a melody that felt as ancient as the wind outside. For hours, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the storm, and Abby's soft humming. June's restless tossing began to still. Her breathing deepened, becoming more regular. The fierce heat in her skin began to subside to a damp warmth. Sometime after midnight, she opened her eyes. They were clear. She saw Abby and managed a weak smile. She then curled onto her side, her small hand reaching out to clutch a fold of Abby's skirt. She fell into a deep, healing sleep. The tension in the cabin broke. Eli let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a day. He moved to the cast-iron stove, his movements clumsy in his relief. "Coffee," he said. "It is a poor brew, but it is hot." He fumbled with the grinder and the pot, a man more at home with branding irons and fence posts. The coffee he eventually poured into 2 tin cups was bitter and thick, but it was the most welcome thing Abby had ever tasted. He sat in a chair across the hearth from her, his long legs stretched toward the flames. He looked at his sleeping daughter, then at Abby. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried immense weight. "I have not seen her that sick since her mother passed." He fell silent. Abby did not press. She understood the shape of that silence. He cleared his throat. "You must think this is a fine welcome. You're intended in a cell. His niece sick, and his brother a poor excuse for a host." A smile, a real one, finally reached his eyes. It transformed his stern face, making him look younger, more like the man in the photograph. It was the first time Abby had seen him truly relax. "I have had worse welcomes," she said, her own lips curving into a small smile. The quiet comfort between them was shattered by a frantic pounding on the door. Eli was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle from above the mantel. He motioned for Abby to stay back before cracking the door open. A man, caked in snow and ice, practically fell inside. It was Ben, an old ranch hand who worked a small plot north of them. He was gasping for air, his face frantic. "Eli, I came as soon as I heard," he panted, pulling off his frozen gloves. "I just got back from town. It is bad." Eli bolted the door against the storm and gave the man a cup of the terrible coffee. "What is it? Ben, what about Silas?" Ben shook his head, looking nervously at Abby. "This ain't just a simple rustling charge. Eli, they are trying to break you. Sheriff Hale has a witness, one of Pike's own men, who swears he saw Silas driving 10 head of Pike's cattle onto your land. They are talking about a hanging judge and a quick trial." "Hale is lying. Silas would never—" Eli began, his voice a low growl. "Of course he is lying," Ben interrupted. "The point ain't justice. The point is the ranch. Luther Pike wants this land. He needs the water rights from Willow Draw for the railroad spur he is planning. If Silas is convicted, they will fine him the value of the cattle tenfold. You will have to sell the ranch to pay it. Pike will be the only buyer." A cold, hard reality settled in the warm cabin. This was not a mistake. It was a conspiracy. Abby stood up. The fear she had felt at the station was gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger. They would not take this from these people. They would not take this small, warm place and crush it. "Then we must prove he is lying," she said. Both men turned to look at her. "What evidence do they have besides one of Pike's men?" she asked, her voice steady. Ben shrugged. "His word against Silas's. And in this town, Baron Pike's word is law." "No," Abby said. "The land is evidence. The cattle are evidence." "Did Silas's herd mix with Pike's?" "Never," Eli said. "Our herds graze miles apart, and ours are marked." "With what?" she pressed. "A brand, an R for Reed. And Pike's, a P with a long tail." "There must be tracks," she continued, thinking aloud. Tracks of the men who actually moved the cattle. Their boots would be different from a rancher's. And the cattle themselves. You buy salt for your herd. Do you not? Medicated salt? Eli nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Iodine salt. For the calves, I buy it at the general store. The owner keeps a ledger. That ledger will show when you last bought salt, and for how many head. It can prove you did not suddenly add 10 new cattle to your herd. The boot prints, the ledger, the location of the herds. It is a start. It is more than just one man's word against another's." A sudden, hard knock echoed, louder than the last. It was not a sound of urgency, but of authority. Eli's hand went to his rifle again. He opened the door to a large man with a mean face, snow dusting the shoulders of his thick coat. He was one of the men Abby had seen at the station. "Reed," the man said, his eyes sliding past Eli to fix on Abby. "Sheriff Hale sent me. He wants to know who your guest is. We do not like unaccounted for strangers in Copper Butte, especially not his kind." The threat was clear. Abby stepped forward, her hands steady. She walked to the small table in the center of the room. On it lay a small, single-shot cap-lock pistol she had kept in her travel bag for emergencies. She did not point it. She did not brandish it. She simply picked it up and laid it on the table, next to the half-empty coffee cups. It was a statement. I am a guest in this home. I have a right to be here, and I have a right to defend myself. The man's eyes narrowed. He looked from the small pistol to Eli's large rifle. He sneered, but the aggression in his posture faltered. He was one man against two, and one of them was an angry Reed brother. Just a friendly warning, he muttered, backing out into the storm. Eli shut the door, his jaw tight. He looked at the small pistol on the table, then at Abby. "Can you shoot that thing?" he asked quietly. Abby met his gaze. "I shoot poorly," she said honestly, "but up close, I still hit." For the second time that night, Eli Reed smiled. It was a grim, wolfish thing, but it was a smile. He was not alone in this fight. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the way she instinctively checked on June, tucking the blanket more securely. He saw the way her mother's shawl, now draped over a chair to dry, seemed to belong in his house. A deep, quiet respect began to form in his heart, a feeling that came long before any thought of romance. She was not a fragile mail-order bride looking for a meal ticket. She was a fighter. He had thought he was offering her a single night of charity. He was beginning to realize she was offering him something far more valuable, a chance. Abby, for her part, saw him clearly, too. He was not a white knight, riding in to save her. His kindness was practical, rooted in necessity and a deep, buried decency. He had offered her shelter from the storm because it was the right thing to do, not because he was a savior. They were two people pushed into a corner, and they were beginning to push back. The next morning, the blizzard had not stopped. A section of the corral fence, the one Abby had noticed upon arriving, finally gave way with a great crack, the sound swallowed by the wind. "The cattle," Eli said, his voice tight with alarm. "If they get out in this, they will be lost. They will freeze." He pulled on his heavy coat and hat, preparing to go out into the white hell. "I am coming with you," Abby said, already wrapping her own shawl around her head and pulling on the thin gloves from her bag. "You are not," he said. "You are not dressed for this. You will freeze." "I have been cold before. Mr. Reed, those cattle are your livelihood. They are Silas's future. We will fix the fence," he argued. But there was no time. He saw the resolve in her eyes and gave in. He found her a spare oilskin slicker, much too large, and they stepped out into the storm. The cold was a physical blow. The wind drove ice crystals into their faces like needles. They fought their way to the barn, the snow already up to their knees. Working together, they gathered a post driver, new pine logs, and coils of wire. The work was brutal. They could not see more than a few feet. The wind tore at their clothes and stole their breath. But Abby worked. She held the posts steady while Eli drove them into the frozen ground. She pulled the wire taut, her hands, even with gloves, quickly growing numb and clumsy. She did not complain. She did not falter. She just worked. Her face set, her body braced against the wind. Eli watched her, amazed. He had his own ideas about women from the East, women who ordered husbands through the mail. He thought they would be soft, accustomed to comfort. This woman was tougher than half the men he knew. She had a core of iron forged in a fire he could only imagine. As they finally secured the last wire, a figure on horseback appeared through the swirling snow. It was Mr. Tibbs, the station master, leading a second horse. He looked half frozen, but his face was urgent. He dismounted, handing Eli a small, oilcloth-wrapped package. "From Silas," he said, his words coming out in white puffs. "He wrote it the morning he was taken. He told me to give it to you only if you were in real trouble. After seeing Hale's man sniffing around, I figured now was the time." Eli tore open the package. Inside was a letter from his brother. The handwriting was rushed. It spoke of his fears of being framed by Pike, of the railroad deal, of his love for his family, and at the end, a single, cryptic line. "If I am framed, Eli, do not trust the law. Do not trust the town. Trust the Iron Brand. Eli looked up from the page. His brow furrowed. Iron Brand. The name meant nothing to him. He looked at Abby, the snow clinging to her eyelashes, her face red from the cold, but her eyes bright and clear. She was no longer just a mail-order bride he had taken in for a night. She was his partner, and together they had just been given their first real clue. Back inside the cabin, the warmth was a shock after the biting cold. Eli smoothed the letter on the rough wooden table, his finger tracing the last two words. Trust the Iron Brand. He shook his head. It is just a name. I have never heard of a person or a place called that around here. Abby stared at the words, a strange feeling stirring in her, a memory from a life she had left far behind. Iron Brand. It was not a common name. It was specific. My father, she said slowly, her voice barely a whisper. Before he moved east, he was a blacksmith. He worked for a time in a forge near the Laramie Road. The master smith was a German man, very particular. He called his forge the Iron Brand. Eli looked at her, his expression shifting from confusion to intense focus. Your father worked there. He was an apprentice, Abby confirmed. He learned his trade there. The master smith had a special mark, a tiny flourish he added to his branding irons. Right next to the main brand, he said it was his guarantee, a mark that could not be easily copied. He taught my father how to do it. A unique mark. Eli breathed, the pieces clicking into place. Silas must have known. He must have had his branding iron made there. It was more than a clue. It was a key. If they could prove the cattle on their land had the true Reed brand, and that any brand on cattle Pike claimed were stolen was a forgery, their case would be solid. The storm lessened with the dawn, leaving a world sculpted in white. The sky was a pale, clean blue, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. As soon as June was settled with a bowl of oatmeal, telling a story to her ragged doll, Eli and Abby rode out. They did not head toward town, but toward the boundary line where Pike's land met the Reed property, the place where the supposed theft had occurred. The scene was a pristine blanket of snow, but underneath, the ground was frozen solid. The snow preserved what lay beneath it. Eli dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep powder. He began to clear away the snow in wide arcs with his gloved hands. Abby did the same. Here, she said, her voice sharp. She pointed. It was a footprint, but not the smooth, worn print of a cowboy boot. This one was studded with a pattern of small metal nails. Hobnails, the kind factory workers or men in the city wore. Men who walked on cobblestones. Not open range. There were several sets of prints, all of them telling the same story of men unused to this land. And this, Eli said, his voice grim. He pulled a length of wire from the base of a fence post. It was new, the barb sharp and vicious. Barbed wire. We do not use it. It tears up the cattle. We use smooth wire. Pike fences his whole territory with this stuff. The story was writing itself. City men, hired by Pike, had cut the fence and driven the cattle. They had been clumsy, leaving tracks a child could read. Their investigation was cut short by the sight of a lone figure walking toward them from the direction of town. It was a woman, wrapped in a heavy black cloak. That is Martha Joy, Eli said. Her husband was the postmaster. He passed last year. Martha approached them hesitantly, her eyes darting around as if she feared being watched. She clutched a small parcel in her hands. Mr. Reed, she said, her voice a nervous whisper. I should not be here, but my Joseph, he always said a man's conscience was his only true compass. She looked at Abby, her gaze softening with a shared understanding of what it was to be a woman alone in this hard country. The night your brother was arrested, she continued, her words tumbling out, I could not sleep. I heard a wagon. It was late, and it did not have the sound of a local cart. The wheels were heavier. It came from the direction of Pike's land. I did not see who was driving. but I heard them. They were laughing. It was not honest laughter. "Why did you not tell the sheriff?" Abby asked gently. Martha's face crumpled. "Sheriff Hale, he holds the mortgage on my small house. To speak against Baron Pike would be to find myself and my children out in the snow. I am sorry. I am a coward." "You are not a coward," Eli said, his voice firm but kind. "You are a mother." "Thank you. Martha, you have taken a great risk coming here." She nodded, then pushed the small parcel into Abby's hands. "This came for you. A letter. I kept it aside, thinking it best not to leave it in the general delivery box." She turned and hurried away, a small, brave shadow against the vast white snow. The letter was from Abby's cousin back east, filled with family news that seemed to come from another world. But tucked inside was a $10 bill. A fortune. Later that day, in the Copper Butte General Store, that fortune felt like a curse. The store was the town's hub, a cluttered space that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and kerosene. Abby needed to buy flour and sugar for her biscuit promise, and some ointment for Eli's hands, which were chapped raw from the fence work. The storekeeper, a man with a sour face named Jebediah Finch, watched her enter. He served Eli with a grudging respect, but when Abby placed her items on the counter, he sneered. "We do not take Cheyenne money here." Abby's hands tightened on her reticule. The $10 bill felt hot through the fabric. Before she could speak, Eli stepped forward, placing his large frame between her and the storekeeper. He leaned over the counter, his voice dangerously quiet. "Her money is United States dollars. Mr. Finch, same as yours. Same as the Baron's. It spends the same. Now, you will take the lady's money and give her the change, or I will take my business, and my brother's, and that of every man who works for us, down the road to Laramie." Finch's face paled. He looked from Eli's cold eyes to the few other customers in the store, who were now watching with keen interest. He snatched the bill from Abby's hand, rang up the sale, and slapped the change down on the counter without a word. "Outside?" Abby's hands were shaking. Eli walked beside her in silence for a moment. "I am sorry you had to endure that," he said finally. "I have endured worse," she replied, though the sting of the insult remained. "Thank you for what you did." "It was nothing," he said gruffly. "It was the truth." They decided to take a shortcut back to the ranch, a narrow path that wound through a thick stand of aspens. As they rounded a bend, Eli suddenly cried out, a sharp curse of pain. He stumbled. His leg caught. Abby rushed to his side, a huge steel bear trap, its jaws lined with teeth, had snapped shut on his boot. It was new, well-oiled, and had been hidden under a light dusting of snow right in the middle of the path. If he had taken one more step, it would have shattered his leg. As it was, the metal teeth had bitten through the thick leather of his boot, narrowly missing his skin but bruising the bone underneath. "Do not move," Abby commanded, her voice calm and steady. She knelt in the snow, examining the powerful springs. Her father's forge had been a place of tools and mechanisms. She understood how things worked. She found the release catch, but the springs were too strong for her to press by hand. She looked around, her eyes scanning the woods. She grabbed a sturdy, fallen branch, and using it as a lever, she put all of her weight onto the release mechanism. The jaws of the trap groaned and slowly opened. Eli pulled his leg free, his face tight with pain and anger. This was no accident. This was a message from Pike's men. He leaned on her as they walked the rest of the way back to the ranch. The incident, brutal as it was, had forged a new link between them. He had seen her courage. She had seen his vulnerability. They were relying on each other in a way that went beyond mere convenience. That evening, as Abby prepared a poultice for Eli's bruised ankle, June sat at the table, a very serious expression on her face. "I have decided," the little girl announced. "There are rules for living at Willow Draw now." "Oh," Abby said, playing along. "And what are the rules?" "First," she said, holding up one finger, "you must like biscuits. A lot. Second, you must tell a good story before bed, not a scary one." Abby smiled. "It seems like a fair contract." June nodded gravely. It will be signed with sugar crumbs." The small moment of levity was a balm. It made the cabin feel more like a home and less like a headquarters for a war. The next day, Abby returned to the general store alone. She did not go to buy goods. She went to look at the ledger Eli had mentioned. Finch was not there, only his young, nervous assistant. Abby asked to see the record of her iodine salt purchase, pretending she had lost her receipt. The boy, eager to be helpful, pulled out the heavy book. Abby found the entry for Reed Ranch, the date of the last purchase. For a 50-pound sack, was clearly marked, but something was wrong. The ink of the date was slightly darker, slightly thicker than the ink of the rest of the entry. It had been written over. The original date had been changed, altered to make it look like the purchase was more recent, as if to accommodate a herd that had suddenly grown by 10 head. It was a clumsy forgery, but in a world without forensic experts, it was the kind of lie that could send a man to the gallows. With this new proof, they rode to see the blacksmith at Ironbrand. The forge was old, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. The master smith, a man named Gustav, was old as well, with huge, gnarled hands and a kind, weary face. He remembered Abby's father, and he remembered the Reed brand. "Ja," he said, his German accent thick. "The Reed brothers. Good men. I made that iron for their father 20 years ago, and I made a new one for Silas last year." He pointed to a mark on an old piece of iron. "See this? It is my mark. A small flame, hidden in the scrollwork of the R. No one else makes this. It proves the iron is mine." "Would you testify to that in court?" Eli asked. Gustav sighed, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "To testify against Baron Pike is to invite the fox into your henhouse. Sheriff Hale would be on my doorstep before the sun sets, finding all sorts of new taxes I owe, new regulations I have broken." "But an innocent man's life is at stake," Abby said quietly. The old blacksmith looked at her, and his eyes softened. "You have your father's fire, child, and his sense of right. Very well. If you can guarantee me protection, I will tell the court what I know. Their victories were small, but they were adding up." That evening, Eli went into the saloon in Copper Butte, hoping to hear some loose talk. Abby waited for him across the street, watching the light spill from the saloon's swinging doors. He was not in there long before the doors swung open and Sheriff Hale stepped out, followed by Eli. Hale was smiling, a cruel, confident expression on his face. He saw Abby across the street and his smile widened. "Well, Reed," the sheriff said, his voice carrying in the cold. "Still air, I see you found a new housekeeper. Be careful she does not steal the silver. It is in their blood, you know." Eli's body went rigid. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a step toward the sheriff, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But before he could act, Abby crossed the street. She walked calmly, her head held high, and stopped before the sheriff. She did not look at Eli. She looked directly into Hale's eyes. The half-dozen men who had followed the sheriff out of the saloon went quiet, sensing a confrontation. "Sheriff," Abby said, her voice even and clear, without a trace of fear, "your job is to uphold the law, is it not?" Haley was taken aback. "Why, yes, it is. The law of Wyoming Territory." "Then please," she said, "tell me, what law is it, exactly, that gives you the right to insult a child?" The sheriff blinked. "A child? What are you talking about?" "My father was a Scot." She said, "My mother was Cheyenne. Which half of me are you insulting tonight?" "Sheriff, and whatever your answer, please know that you are also insulting my father's child, and my mother's child, You are insulting a memory, and you are doing it in front of the whole town." A dead silence fell over the street. The men behind Hale shifted uncomfortably. They were hard men, but her words had cut through their casual cruelty. She had not appealed to their mercy, but to their sense of order. She had used the law, his own supposed authority, against him. Hale's face turned a blotchy red. He was speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it, with a final, venomous glare. He turned on his heel and stalked away. Eli looked at Abby, a slow, deep admiration dawning in his eyes. She had fought his battle for him, not with fists, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. As they were preparing to leave town, Mr. Tibbs, the station master, rushed out of his office, his face pale with alarm. He grabbed Eli's arm. "A message just came over the wire," he whispered frantically, his eyes wide. It was in code. "But my nephew works for the telegraph office in Laramie." He recognized Pike's cipher. "Pike's men are riding out tonight. They are going to move your boundary markers, the ones on the south pasture. With this new snow, they think no one will ever know where the real line was. They are stealing your land. Eli, tonight." There was no time for deliberation. The telegraph wire was a death knell for their land if they did not act. Back at the cabin, while June slept soundly, exhausted from her recovery, Eli and Abby moved with a grim, silent purpose. This was not a fight they could win with brute force. It had to be won with cunning. Eli checked his Winchester. The metallic slide of the lever, a sharp, definitive sound in the quiet room. He coiled a long lariat of thick rope, its stiffness a testament to its strength. Abby, meanwhile, worked at the table. She took a spare lantern and wrapped its glass housing in a thick piece of burlap, leaving only a small slit for a sliver of light to escape. It would give them enough to see by without broadcasting their position across the frozen landscape. Then she did something Eli did not expect. She found a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a sheet of oiled paper she had used to wrap a small block of cheese. She tucked them into the deep pocket of her coat. They left the cabin in darkness, the moon a cold, distant watcher obscured by high, thin clouds. The world was utterly silent, the snow absorbing all sound. They rode as far as they dared, then tethered the horses in a thicket of snow-heavy pines and proceeded on foot, their movements slow and deliberate, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The boundary was marked by a series of simple wooden posts, now barely visible above the deep snow. A long, shallow ditch, carved by spring melts over the years, ran parallel to the fence line. It was their destination. They settled into the ditch, the snow a cold, damp blanket against their backs. From their position, they had a clear, if distant, view of the boundary markers. The cold was immediate and absolute, seeping through their heavy coats. Waiting was an agony of shivers and strained senses. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher. Just as Abby began to think their information was wrong, she saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. A lantern, swinging as men on horseback approached. There were 3 of them, dark shapes moving with a confident swagger. They were not trying to be quiet. They clearly believed the storm and the night were cover enough. They dismounted near the first marker post, their voices carrying on the still, cold air. One man unrolled a map, its edges flapping. "Pike wants the new line to run from this creek bed here, straight over to that rock formation," he said, his voice grating. "Gives him the whole south pasture and the water access." Another man laughed. "An old man Reed will wake up with 100 fewer acres and not even know how he lost them." The third man began to work at the base of the marker post with a shovel, digging it free from the frozen earth. Abby reached into a small leather pouch at her belt. It held a few trinkets, small things she had carried for luck. Among them was a tiny brass cowbell, no bigger than her thumb. It had a clear, high-pitched tone. Waiting for a gust of wind, she gave it a single, sharp shake. The sound, small as it was, carried. "What was that?" one of the men asked, looking up from his work. "Just the wind in the trees," another grumbled. "Get on with it." But the sound had marked a moment. Abby, in her mind, fixed the exact location of the true post, the sound its anchor in the vast, featureless snow. The men pulled the post free and began to move down the line, their horses in tow. Now was the dangerous part. Eli and Abby crept from the ditch, moving in a low crouch, using the slight rises in the terrain for cover. Pike's men were moving a small group of cattle with them, using them to trample the snow and obscure their tracks. It was a sloppy, arrogant move. But it gave Abby an idea. As the men worked on the next post, their backs to them, Abby and Eli slipped closer to the small herd. The cattle were nervous, their breath steaming. On the flank of a young steer, Abby saw it clearly in the moonlight. The reed brand, and beside it, the tiny, almost invisible flourish of the iron brand smith. "Now," Abby whispered. Eli understood. He uncoiled his lariat. He was not aiming for the horns, but for a hind leg. A single, smooth toss, and the rope settled. The steer balked, and with a sharp tug, Eli pulled it off balance. It stumbled into the deep snow, bellowing in protest. The other men spun around, cursing, while two of them were distracted, trying to calm their own spooked horses. Abby ran forward. She knelt beside the fallen steer, pulled out her oiled paper and the piece of charcoal. She pressed the paper flat against the brand and rubbed furiously. The image of the R with its hidden flame transferred to the paper in a rough, black outline. It was undeniable proof. "Get them!" the man with the map roared, finally realizing what was happening. He drew his pistol. Abby scrambled back as Eli released the steer. They turned and ran, plunging through the waist-deep snow. The chase was not a sprint. It was a desperate, lung-burning struggle. The snow grabbed at their legs, each step a monumental effort. A gunshot cracked the silence, the bullet whining harmlessly over their heads. They did not look back. They ran for the cover of a dense grove of aspens that bordered a frozen creek. They reached the trees, the thin trunks offering little real protection but obscuring the view. They crashed through the underbrush, the roar of their own breathing loud in their ears. The frozen creek bed was just ahead, a flat, white ribbon in the moonlight. Eli was in the lead. He reached the bank and launched himself across. There was a sickening crack, loud as a gunshot, as the ice gave way beneath his weight. He disappeared with a choked cry into the black, churning water. Abby skidded to a stop at the edge of the hole. The current was swift, pulling him under the ice. She could see his dark shape struggling beneath the surface. She had seconds. She ran along the bank, her eyes scanning the ground. She found what she was looking for, a long, dead tree branch, thick as her arm. She broke it free from the snow and shoved it down into the hole in the ice. "Grab it!" she screamed, her voice raw. A hand, slick and freezing, broke the surface and clamped onto the wood. Abby dug her heels into the snowy bank, holding on with all her strength. But the current was too strong, and Eli was a heavy man, his waterlogged coat pulling him down. She was losing her grip. The hoofbeats of Pike's men were getting closer. Eli's head broke the surface. He was gasping, his face a pale mask of shock and cold. His eyes met hers, filled with a terrible, final clarity. "If I go under," he choked out, the words barely audible over the rush of the water. "Tell June. Tell her I was so proud of her." A hot, fierce anger surged through Abby, burning away her fear. She would not let him give up. She would not be the bearer of his last words. "Tell her yourself," she snarled, her voice a whip crack. She let go of the branch with one hand, uncoiling the rope that was still slung over her shoulder. With a speed born of desperation, she tied a loop, a perfect lasso, just as her father had taught her. She tossed it, the rope flying true. It settled over Eli's head and shoulders. She pulled the slack, tightening it under his arms. She wrapped the other end of the rope around the base of a thick aspen and pulled. It was a battle of inches. The rope bit into her frozen hands. Her muscles screamed. But he was moving, slowly, agonizingly. She dragged him from the grip of the current and onto the solid ice. He lay there, gasping, shivering so violently his teeth chattered. Pike's men burst through the trees onto the opposite bank. They raised their pistols. Eli, on his hands and knees, managed to pull his own revolver. He did not aim at the men. He fired into the air. The shot was a thunderclap in the enclosed space. He fired again. The horses, already nervous, reared and screamed. One of them broke free, bolting back the way it had come. The men, their advantage lost in the chaos, hesitated. "We will see you in court. Read," one of them shouted, his voice full of frustrated rage. He turned his horse and galloped after his companions, disappearing into the night. They were alone. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, painful ordeal. Eli could barely walk, the intense cold having seized his muscles. He leaned heavily on Abby, every step an effort. Back inside, in the golden light of the fire, the reality of what had happened settled. Abby stripped off Eli's frozen coat and shirt, wrapping him in dry blankets. She chafed his hands and feet, trying to bring life back to them. As she was working on his left hand, she saw it, a long, thin splinter of wood, driven deep into his palm when he had grabbed the branch. Without a word, she fetched her sewing kit. Using a fine needle, she carefully, gently, worked the splinter free. Her touch was light, her focus absolute. It was an act of profound, simple care. He watched her, his face pale, his eyes dark with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something new and fragile. The space between them was charged with all the things they had just survived. "This house," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It is warmer since you came." He stopped, as if the words had cost him too much. He looked away, toward the fire, not yet ready to face the truth of what he had just admitted. Abby finished tending to his hand and stood up, giving him the space he needed. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a bond forged in fire and ice. The next day, Eli, though still stiff and sore, wrote a letter. It was to a man in Laramie named Patrick Miles, a lawyer he had heard of. Miles was known as a wanderer, a man who took cases not for money, but for justice. He was their only hope. Eli sent one of the ranch hands, a trustworthy young man, to ride to Laramie and deliver it. They had their proof, the hobnail tracks, the forged ledger, the witness at the forge. And now, the charcoal rubbing of the true brand and the evidence of the moved boundary markers. For the first time, they felt a flicker of hope. They had a fighting chance. The hope lasted less than a day. Late in the afternoon, 2 riders approached the cabin. It was Sheriff Hale and one of his deputies. They did not knock. Hale pushed the door open and stood on the threshold, his shadow falling long into the room. His eyes were cold chips of stone. He was not smiling now. "Abigail Quinn," he said, his voice flat and official. "I have a warrant for your arrest." "On what charge?" Eli demanded, rising to his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle on the mantel. The deputy drew his pistol. "I would not do that. Read." "The charge," Hale said, a look of triumph on his face, "is obstruction of an official investigation. You have been interfering in the case against Silas Reed, and now you are going to sit in a cell and think about it." The Copper Butte jail was not a single cell, but a single room in the back of the sheriff's office, divided by iron bars. It held 2 narrow cots with thin, foul-smelling blankets, a bucket for waste, and the lingering despair of every person who had ever been caged there. The cold from the stone floor seeped into Abby's bones, a damp, relentless chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She was not alone. 2 other women occupied the cell. One was a young woman with a vacant expression, arrested for drunkenness. The other was an older, harder woman who had been caught in a card game the sheriff deemed dishonest. They had watched Abby's arrival with a dull, practiced indifference. This was just another Tuesday. But Abby was not indifferent, and she was not afraid. A cold, hard anger had settled deep in her soul, a protective shell around the core of her being. She sat on the edge of the cot, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She would not give Sheriff Hale the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had faced down bullies her entire life. This one just happened to wear a star. He came for her in the evening. He dismissed his deputy and entered the cell area alone, carrying a lantern that cast long, dancing shadows. He pulled up a stool, the picture of casual authority. "Quinn," he began, his voice oiled with false concern. "This is all just a misunderstanding, a terrible mix-up. You sign a simple statement confirming you saw Silas Reed acting suspiciously around Pike's herd, and I can make all this go away. You can be on the next train east, with a little money for your trouble." Abby met his gaze. Her silence was a weapon he did not know how to fight. "What kind of statement, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice even. "Just the truth," he said, smiling. "The truth as I see it. You just need to agree." Abby nodded slowly. "I would be happy to provide a statement. Please have a scribe brought in to take it down, word for word, and I will require a witness to be present, someone who is not in your employ, to ensure accuracy." Hale's smile vanished. The request was reasonable, logical, and it completely dismantled his plan to coerce her in private. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected a calm, legal countermove. "That will not be necessary," he snapped. "Then I will wait until it is," she said, and turned her head to look at the stone wall. A clear, final dismissal. He stood there for a long moment, his face darkening with rage. He was not used to being defied, especially not by a woman, and certainly not by one he considered his inferior. He spun on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The older woman in the cell let out a low whistle. "Well, I will be. You have got sand, girl, more than any man in this town." Meanwhile, Eli Reed was not idle. He did not go to Sheriff Hale's office to offer a bribe or make a threat. He knew that was Pike's game, a game he could not win. Instead, he chose a harder, more dangerous path. He chose to trust the community, or at least the small pockets of decency within it. He rode first to the Iron Brand Forge. He found Gustav hammering a horseshoe into shape, the air ringing with the sound of metal on metal. Eli told him about Abby's arrest. The old blacksmith set down his hammer, his face a grim mask in the firelight. "This is not law," he said, his accent thick with disgust. "This is tyranny. To arrest a woman, to silence a family." He wiped his hands on his leather apron. "I gave you my word. Eli, I will not break it. I will speak in court." Next, Eli went to the small house where Martha Joy lived. She came to the door, her children hiding behind her skirts. When she heard the news, her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "They took her," she whispered, just for trying to help. Eli stood on her porch, his hat in his hands. He did not pressure her. "Martha," he said, his voice gentle, "I am not asking you to speak against the sheriff. Not yet. But I am asking you to write down what you told us, what you heard that night, just the facts. If enough people write down the truth, it becomes heavier than one man's lie." He left her with a pen and paper, and with a choice. His last stop was the train station. Mr. Tibbs was sorting mail, his movements jerky and nervous. He already knew. News, good or bad, traveled fast in Copper Butte. "It is the railroad," Tibbs said, his voice low. "Though they were alone, that is what this is all about. I was looking over some freight manifests. Baron Pike has invested a fortune in a new spur line for the Union Pacific. He has promised them a watering station and a loading depot, but he can only build it if he has the water rights from Willow Draw. He needs your land, Eli. He needs it so badly he is willing to destroy your family to get it." The pieces were no longer just a puzzle. They were a blueprint for a crime. Back in the jail cell, a strange sort of camaraderie had formed. Abby, seeing the hopelessness in the other women, decided to offer a small act of defiance. "You know," she said, "it is a funny name, Hale." The other two looked at her, their interest piqued. "It is spelled Hale," she explained, as if teaching a class, "like the word Hale, which means to be healthy and strong, but I think, in his case, his soul has a definite limp." The older woman let out a bark of laughter. The younger one smiled for the first time. It was a small thing, a joke in a cold cell, but it felt like a victory. They were not just prisoners. They were women sharing a moment of wit at their captor's expense. The next day, Eli brought June to visit. The deputy on duty was a young man with a conscience, and he allowed the child to come to the bars. June's small face was pressed against the cold iron, her eyes wide and full of a sadness that tore at Abby's heart. "Are you in trouble, Mommy?" she whispered. "No, sweetheart," Abby said, her voice thick with emotion. "The sheriff just needs my help with some questions. I will be home soon." June pushed something through the bars. It was a small, irregularly shaped piece of turquoise, polished smooth and tied to a leather thong. It was beautiful, the color of a summer sky. "My mama gave it to me," June said, her voice solemn. "She said it keeps the bad spirits away. You should have it now, to keep you safe." Abby took the charm, its surface cool against her skin. She closed her hand around it. A silent promise. "Thank you, June. I will keep it very safe." Eli stood behind his daughter, his face a study in torment. He looked helpless, his strength useless against the iron bars that separated them. He had brought a basket with bread and a jar of milk, but he seemed to have forgotten it. He just stared at Abby, his eyes saying everything his mouth could not. He stayed after the deputy led June away. He stood at the bars, his hands gripping them so tightly his knuckles were white. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken feelings. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low Abby had to lean forward to hear it. The words were rough, torn from him. I need you at home." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a promise of a future. It was a simple, profound statement of fact. Home. The word hung in the air between them. For Eli Reed, a man who had sealed his heart after his wife's death. The word was a fortress, and he had just invited her inside. Before Abby could find a reply, the deputy returned, and Eli was gone. The next morning brought a new arrival to Copper Butte. A man disembarked from the morning train, a worn leather satchel in his hand. He was of middling height, with a rumpled suit and a gaze that missed nothing. He walked directly to the sheriff's office and introduced himself. He was Patrick Miles, attorney at law. He presented the stunned deputy with a writ of habeas corpus, a legal document demanding that the sheriff present his prisoner, Abigail Quinn, before a judge and show just cause for her imprisonment. Hale, furious at being outmaneuvered, had no choice but to comply. A hearing was set for that afternoon before the local circuit judge. But Eli's work was not yet done. That morning, people from all over the area arrived at his ranch. Gustav, the blacksmith, Martha Joy, who had written out her statement, her hand shaking but her resolve firm, Mr. Tibbs, carrying his freight manifests, even a few cowhands who had worked for Silas and despised Baron Pike. One by one, they signed their names to a single document, a sworn affidavit attesting to Abigail Quinn's good character and the suspicious circumstances of her arrest. That Sunday, the preacher stood in his small church. His congregation was larger than usual. Sheriff Hale sat in the front pew, looking pious. The preacher opened his Bible. He did not speak of fire and brimstone. He spoke of public duty, of the trust placed in men who wear a star, and of the higher court to which all men must eventually answer. He never mentioned Hale by name, But every person in that church knew who the sermon was for. At the hearing, the judge, a stern but fair man, looked at the writ. He looked at the flimsy, unsubstantiated charge of obstruction, and he looked at the affidavit, with its long list of signatures from the town's most respected and most humble citizens. He looked at Sheriff Hale, his eyes cold. "Sheriff," he said, "your evidence for this charge appears to be based on nothing more than your own opinion. That is not sufficient to hold this woman. Bail is set at $20, he declared, which, he added, has already been posted by a collection from the citizens of this town. Miss Quinn, you are free to go." A wave of relief washed over Abby so powerful it almost buckled her knees. But the judge was not finished. He turned his attention to the matter of Silas Reed. In light of the new information and the questions raised about the conduct of the sheriff's office, "I am moving this case out of this jurisdiction. The trial of Silas Reed versus the Territory will be held at the district court in Laramie. It will commence in 10 days. Abby walked out of the jail into the clean, cold air, a free woman. Eli was waiting for her. The look they shared was one of quiet, profound relief. But the victory was fleeting. They had won her freedom. But now, the clock was ticking. They had 10 days to save Silas's life. The 10 days felt like a lifetime and no time at all. Abby's freedom was a fragile thing, a temporary reprieve in a war that was escalating. The air in Copper Butte had changed. There were fewer open sneers, replaced by furtive glances and hushed conversations that stopped when Eli or Abby drew near. They had supporters now, a small, brave coalition of the decent. But Baron Pike's power was a long shadow that touched everything. They spent their days with Patrick Miles, the lawyer, who had taken up temporary residence in their barn, finding the scent of hay preferable to the hotel. They went over every piece of evidence, the hobnail prints, the forged ledger, the charcoal rubbing of the iron brand. Miles listened, his sharp eyes missing nothing, assembling the facts like a master carpenter building a case. On the 5th day, the sky turned the color of a lead ingot. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell eerily silent. A strange, oppressive stillness settled over the land. "Norther," Eli said, his gaze fixed on the bruised horizon. "A bad one." The storm hit not with a gradual crescendo, but like a physical blow. The temperature plummeted. A wall of wind slammed into the ranch, shrieking like a banshee. Snow, hard and sharp as sand, flew horizontally, erasing the world. It was a storm with teeth. All afternoon, they worked to secure the cabin and the animals. They brought extra firewood, checked the shutters, and reinforced the door. The roar of the wind was a constant, physical pressure, making the very logs of the cabin groan. Sometime after dark, a sound, sharp and splintering, cut through the gale. It came from the direction of the barn. "The roof!" Eli yelled over the storm's fury. He grabbed a lantern and his coat. Abby was right behind him, pulling on her own wraps. In the small bubble of lantern light, they saw the devastation. A huge section of the barn roof had been torn away by the wind, leaving the interior exposed to the blizzard. Snow was already piling up inside. But worse was the sound, a chorus of weak, desperate bleating. "The birthing pen," Eli said, his face grim. "We have 3 cows due. It seems they decided tonight was the night." Inside the barn, the scene was chaos. The wind and snow swirled through the gaping hole in the roof. 2 cows had already given birth, their newborn calves shivering and struggling in the rapidly accumulating snow. A 3rd cow was in the middle of a difficult labor. A neighbor, a tough, weathered man named Samuel, who lived a mile down the creek, appeared out of the storm, drawn by the same sense of duty that drove Eli. Without a word, the 3 of them went to work. They moved the 2 cows and their new calves to a more sheltered section of the barn, piling hay around them for warmth. Abby, using skills she had not known she possessed, helped the 3rd cow deliver her calf, a small, weak bull who seemed too fragile for this brutal world. They worked by the swinging, uncertain light of the lantern, their hands numb, their faces raw from the wind. After they had done all they could, Samuel shouted over the wind, "I am missing one, the little heifer calf from the first cow." She must have wandered off in the confusion. A search in this storm was suicide, but to leave the calf was to condemn it to death. "Stay here," Eli yelled to Abby. "Keep them warm." But as he and Samuel prepared to search, Abby noticed something. The mother cow was frantic, her head turned toward the back of the barn, a small, unused door that led out to the open pasture. It was unlatched, swinging in the wind. The calf had gone that way. Abby did not think. She acted. She grabbed a small bell from a harness hanging on the wall and a length of twine. She ran to the mother cow, tied the bell around its neck, and then, pulling on the heaviest oilskin she could find, she slipped out the back door into the full, unrestrained fury of the storm. The world outside was a white, roaring chaos. She was blind in an instant, but she could hear it, the faint, desperate clanging of the cowbell as the mother called for her lost baby. Abby followed the sound, her head down, one hand held out in front of her. She found the calf huddled in the lee of a snowdrift, half buried and shivering violently. It was too weak to stand. She gathered the small, freezing animal into her arms, its weight a fragile burden. She turned to go back, but the sound of the bell was gone, swallowed by the storm. She was lost. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. The cabin, the barn. They could be 10 feet away or a mile. She had no idea. The cold was a living thing now, sinking its teeth into her, stealing the strength from her limbs. She sank to her knees, the calf a dead weight. She was going to die here, a few hundred yards from the warmth of home. Then a different sound, a man's voice roaring her name, Abigail. It was Eli. He was a dark shape in the swirling snow, a ghost, a prayer answered. He had seen her slip out, seen the mother cow's distress, and had come after her. He had found her tracks, faint as they were, just before they vanished completely. He took the calf from her without a word, his face a mask of terror and relief. He slung the animal over his shoulders and then half-carried, half-dragged Abby back toward the faint, golden light of the barn. They stumbled inside, into the relative quiet. Samuel had managed to secure a tarp over the hole in the roof, and the wind's roar was muffled. Eli set the calf down by its mother and then turned to Abby. He stripped the frozen slicker from her, his hands rough. Her own hands were blue, devoid of feeling. He led her to a small, dry storage room at the back of the barn, a place filled with the sweet smell of dried clover. He sat her down on a pile of empty grain sacks. He took her frozen hands in his own, which were large and calloused, but radiated a fierce heat. He began to rub them, briskly at first, then more gently, as feeling began to return in a wave of pins and needles. "You foolish woman," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "You could have died." "I could not let it die," she whispered, her teeth chattering. He kept rubbing her hands, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles over her palms. The warmth from his skin was more than just physical. It was a current of life, of care, flowing directly into her. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the muffled howl of the wind. He looked down at her hand, a small smile touching his lips. A piece of hay was stuck to her cheek. He reached out and brushed it away, his touch feather light. "The little bull calf," he said, his voice softer now. "He licked your hand when you were helping him." "He did not," she said, a weak smile forming on her own face. "He did," Eli insisted, his eyes twinkling in the lantern light, "a big, wet kiss. But do not tell June. She would be jealous." The shared, silly secret, in the heart of the storm, was a moment of pure, unexpected grace. It was a bridge built between them, stronger than any fence. The norther blew itself out by the next evening. The world it left behind was silent, white and beautiful. But the peace was short-lived. As Abby went to the barn to check on the new calves, she smelled it. Smoke. Not the familiar scent of the cabin's chimney, but the sharp, acrid smell of burning hay. She ran. A plume of black smoke was coiling from the hayloft. Fire! Eli and Samuel were there in an instant, organizing a bucket brigade from the well. They fought the fire with a desperate fury, knowing that if it took hold of the old, dry wood of the barn, the entire ranch would be lost. They managed to contain it, to beat it back, leaving a charred, smoking hole in the loft and the stench of ruin. It was not an accident. As Abby sifted through the blackened hay, she found it, a shattered piece of a clay jug, and a dark, oily stain on the floorboards that had not burned. The smell was unmistakable. Pine oil, a common fire starter. Someone had climbed into the loft during the storm and tried to burn them out. Pike was no longer content to fight in the courts. He was trying to kill them. That same day, Patrick Miles put his own plan into motion. He hired a quiet, unassuming man, a failed prospector with a talent for shorthand, and set him up in the corner of the Copper Butte saloon with a drink and a newspaper. His only job was to listen to Pike's men as they drank and boasted, and to write down everything they said. The fire and the escalating danger had a strange effect on the town. It was a step too far. Martha Joy, her fear replaced by a steely resolve, went door to door, speaking to the other women of the town. She did not ask for much, a few coins from each. By the end of the day, she had collected enough money to pay the bail for Silas Reed, ensuring he would at least be able to stand in court as a free man. A few local ranchers, men who had long resented Pike's stranglehold on the cattle market, quietly offered Eli their support, promising to stand with him at the trial. That night, the new, fragile peace at the ranch was heavy with unspoken fear. June was asleep, the turquoise charm safely back around her neck. Eli and Abby sat before the fire, the silence stretching between them. Eli finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the flames. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice low and strained. "She died of a fever. It came on fast. One day she was fine. The next she was gone. I could not do anything. I just watched her slip away." He looked at Abby, his face etched with a pain so deep it seemed a part of his bones. "When I saw you out there in the snow," he said, his voice breaking, "when I saw Hale put you in that cell, I felt the same thing, that same cold, helpless feeling. I'm tired of losing people I care about. Abigail." He had called her Abigail. He had admitted he cared. He had opened the door to his guarded heart and shown her the fear that lived inside. While the adults wrestled with their fears, June was taking matters into her own small hands. She had been practicing her letters. With a piece of charcoal on a sheet of butcher paper, she carefully, painstakingly wrote a single sentence, over and over. "Silas is innocent." She made a dozen of these small posters. The next day, when Eli and Abby went to town, June went with them, and with a solemn sense of purpose, she used a pot of flour paste to stick her signs all over the town square. The crudely spelled signs, in a child's unsteady hand, did more to sway public opinion than any legal argument could have. People saw them and were shamed. They were reminded that this was not just about land and cattle. It was about a family. Their luck, it seemed, was turning. While investigating the source of the arson, Eli followed a set of tracks from the back of the barn down to the creek. There, stuck in the mud of the bank, was a boot. It was not a cowboy boot. It was a heavy, city-made boot, with a distinct pattern of hobnails on the sole. It was an exact match to the prints they had found at the boundary line. And their luck held. Acting on a tip from one of the sympathetic ranchers, Abby and Eli made a quiet visit to one of Pike's remote line shacks, a place his men used when they were working far from the main ranch. Hidden under a pile of old burlap sacks in the back, they found it, a branding iron. It was a perfect copy of the Reed's R. But it was new, hastily made, and when they examined it closely, they saw that it lacked the one thing it could not replicate, the tiny, hidden flame of the iron brand. It was the fake. The tool used to frame Silas. They had found their golden proof. They rode back to the ranch, a feeling of grim triumph in their hearts. They had the evidence. They had the witnesses. They had a chance. They opened the door to their cabin to find it in shambles. Furniture was overturned. Drawers were pulled out. And in the center of the room stood Sheriff Hale, a cold smile on his face. "Evening. Reed," the sheriff said, his voice casual. "I had reason to believe you were concealing a weapon used in a crime, just conducting a legal search." He held up the fake branding iron they had just found. "And look what I discovered, hidden right under your floorboards." "Looks like you have some explaining to do." The Laramie District Courthouse was a world away from the raw, wind-scoured plains of Copper Butte. It was a place of dark, polished wood, high ceilings that swallowed sound, and the solemn weight of established law. Sunlight filtered through tall, dusty windows, fell in solemn bars across the room, illuminating a crowd of spectators who sat in silent, tense anticipation. At the front, on a raised dais, sat Judge Elias Thorne, an old man with a face like carved granite and eyes that had seen every form of human folly and deceit. At one table sat Baron Luther Pike, dressed in a fine city suit, looking more like a banker than a cattleman. Beside him was his lawyer, a slick, well-fed man from Cheyenne named Alistair Finch, who radiated an aura of smug confidence. Sheriff Hale sat behind them, his face a mask of false gravity. At the other table sat Silas Reed, pale and thin after his ordeal, but with a spark of defiance in his eyes. Eli was beside him, his large frame rigid, his hands clenched into fists on the tabletop. Between them, a little further back, sat Abby. She wore a simple dark dress, her mother's beaded shawl draped over her shoulders, a splash of vibrant life in the somber room. Patrick Miles sat beside them, his rumpled suit a stark contrast to Finch's finery, his papers arranged in a deceptively messy pile. In the front row of the spectators, June sat between Mr. Tibbs and a stern-looking Martha Joy, clutching her ragged doll. The prosecution began its case. Alistair Finch moved with the predatory grace of a panther. He painted a simple, damning picture of a desperate ranching family, the Reeds, who, facing bankruptcy, had resorted to stealing from their prosperous, law-abiding neighbor, Baron Pike. His star witness was Sheriff Hale. The sheriff took the stand and lied with a practiced ease. He spoke of finding Pike's cattle on Reed land, of Silas's supposed confession, which he had conveniently failed to write down. And then came the final, brutal stroke. "And did you, in the course of your investigation, find any other evidence?" "Sheriff," Finch asked, his voice dripping with theatrical importance. "Yes, sir, I did," Hale said, looking directly at the jury. "Pursuant to a legal search of the Reed residence, I discovered this. A deputy brought forth the fake branding iron, the one Hale had planted, and placed it on the evidence table. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was a heavy, damning piece of metal. Finch let the moment hang in the air. "This gentleman of the jury is a forger's tool, an instrument made for the express purpose of altering a brand, of stealing another man's property, found hidden in the defendant's own home." The prosecution rests. A pall of despair settled over the Reed table. Silas slumped in his chair. Eli's face was a thundercloud. It looked hopeless. How could they possibly prove the iron was not theirs? Patrick Miles rose to his feet. He did not move with Finch's swagger, but with a quiet, deliberate purpose. "The defense calls Gustav Schmidt to the stand." The old blacksmith from Ironbrand walked slowly to the witness box, his heavy work boots echoing on the wooden floor. He swore his oath, his German accent thick but his voice clear. Mr. Schmidt, Miles began, you are a blacksmith. For 50 years, yes. And you are familiar with the art of making branding irons. It is my life's work. Miles picked up the fake iron. Can you tell me about this instrument? Gustav took it, his gnarled hands turning it over, examining it with a professional eye. It is a branding iron. An R, poorly made. The balance is wrong. The metal is cheap. A clumsy copy. A copy of what? Miles asked. A copy of the iron I made for Silas Reed. A murmur went through the crowd. Alistair Finch shot to his feet. Objection. The witness is speculating. Overruled, the judge said, his eyes fixed on the blacksmith. Let him continue. How do you know it is a copy? Miles asked. Because it is missing my mark, Gustav said. Every piece that leaves my forge, my iron brand, has my mark. It is a small flame, hidden in the design. It is my guarantee of quality. It proves the work is mine. This thing, he said, dropping the iron back on the table with a loud clang, is a fraud. Miles then produced the charcoal rubbing Abby had made in the snow. And this, Mr. Schmidt, what is this? Gustav studied the paper. This is the Reed brand, the true one. See, there. He pointed with a thick finger. The flame. It is faint, but it is there. This is my work. This is an honest brand. The first crack had appeared in the prosecution's case. Patrick Miles did not let up. The defense calls Mr. Walter Tibbs. The nervous station master took the stand, clutching a thick ledger. Mr. Tibbs, on the night of the alleged cattle theft, did any unusual freight pass through your station? Yes, sir. A single cattle car, added to the late-night train, eastbound. And do you know who paid for that car? Baron Pike's foreman. Sir, it is all right here. He was sending a special shipment of 10 head of cattle to the stockyards in Omaha. The same number of cattle Silas was accused of stealing. The conspiracy was beginning to unravel. Finch's objections grew louder, more desperate. The judge overruled them all. Next, Miles called Martha Joy. She walked to the stand, her fear visible, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. She told of the heavy wagon she had heard in the night. Then Miles produced the ledger from the general store. Mrs. Joy, is this the ledger from Finch's Mercantile? Yes, sir. And did you happen to look at the entry for iodine salt purchased by the Reed Ranch? I did. It seemed altered. The date was written over. Patrick Miles then did something no one expected. He turned to the prosecution's table. The defense calls Jebediah Finch to the stand. The storekeeper looked at his employer, Baron Pike, his face ashen. Pike gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, but the judge's gaze was on Finch. Mr. Finch, you will take the stand. The storekeeper walked as if to his own execution. He was sworn in, his hand trembling. Mr. Finch, Miles said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. You are under oath, an oath before God and this court. I ask you one question. Did you or did you not alter the date in this ledger? Finch began to sweat. He looked at Pike, then at the judge, then at the jury. The weight of all those eyes was too much. His fragile greed crumbled, replaced by the very real fear of prison. Yes, he whispered, his voice cracking. I did. Sheriff Hale, he told me to. He said it was important for the case. A roar erupted in the courtroom. The judge slammed his gavel, his face a mask of cold fury. Order. Order in this court. The case was broken, but Miles was not finished. He put Abby on the stand. She did not speak of evidence or legal points. She spoke in a clear, calm voice, telling the story from the beginning. The abandoned train platform, the threats from Pike's men, the bear trap, the fire in the barn. She told them about the railroad spur and the water rights, and the true reason a good man was sitting in the defendant's chair. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness to a great injustice. Then Eli took the stand. He corroborated her story, his words simple, direct, and honest. "We did not want to fight," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "We just wanted the truth. We were trying to save our home. We were trying to save my brother." The final witness was one of Pike's own men, the one whose hobnailed boot Eli had found by the creek. Faced with Finch's confession and the overwhelming evidence against him, the man's bravado shattered. On the stand, under Miles's relentless questioning, he confessed everything. He admitted to moving the boundary markers. He admitted to setting the fire in the hayloft. And he told the court who had paid him to do it. "Sheriff Hale," he said, pointing a shaking finger. And he was getting his orders directly from Baron Pike. The collapse of the conspiracy was total. The courtroom was in an uproar. Alistair Finch sat down, his face pale, his case in ruins. Baron Pike simply stared ahead, his expression unreadable. Judge Thorne did not ask the jury for a verdict. He did it himself. "Silas Reed," he declared, his voice booming through the chamber. "You are found innocent of all charges. You are free to go." A wave of cheers and sobs washed through the room. "As for you, Sheriff Hale," the judge continued, his eyes like ice, "I am issuing a warrant for your immediate arrest on charges of perjury, conspiracy, and abuse of your office. Deputies, take this man into custody." Hale sat frozen in his chair as two district marshals pulled him to his feet and clamped irons on his wrists. "And as for Baron Pike," the judge concluded, "I am ordering a full investigation into your financial affairs and your involvement in this criminal enterprise." The room erupted. Silas was mobbed by his friends. Eli wrapped his brother in a huge bear hug. But in the middle of it all, a small figure ran forward. June launched herself into Abby's arms, her small body trembling. "We get to keep you, Mommy," she cried, her voice muffled against Abby's shoulder. "We get to keep you." Abby held her tight, her own tears finally falling, hot and cleansing. "Yes, sweetheart, you get to keep me." Later, outside on the courthouse steps, amidst the joyous chaos, Eli found Abby standing alone, watching the sunset paint the sky. The air was cool and clean. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, his voice low and a little unsteady, "my offer of shelter was only for one night." Abby turned to look at him, a small, knowing smile on her face. And I was wondering," he said, fumbling with the brim of his hat, "if maybe you would consider staying a little longer." Abby's smile widened. "How much longer?" He finally met her eyes, and in their depth she saw a future she had never dared to dream of. A home, a family, a life. "How about a lifetime?" he whispered. Abby laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Try a lifetime," she said, "and we will see how it goes." He took her hand, his rough palm enveloping hers. It felt like coming home, but as they turned to rejoin their family, a deputy hurried out of the courthouse, his face grim. "He is gone," the deputy said to Eli. "We went to take Pike into custody for questioning, and he was gone. Slipped out a back door during the commotion. The snake is not dead yet. He has just shed his skin." The journey back from Laramie was not a quiet one. Silas Reed, free for the first time in weeks, talked for nearly the entire ride. He was thinner, his face pale from his time in a cell, but his eyes burned with a new, fierce energy. He spoke of the trial, of the lies, of the moment he realized his neighbors were actually telling the truth. Their arrival in Copper Butte was a strange affair. The town, which had once been united in its suspicion of Abby and its fear of Baron Pike, was now split cleanly in two. A few of Pike's known associates and those men who thrived on resentment and rumor turned their faces as the Reed wagon passed, their expressions sullen and defeated. But they were the minority. Mr. Tibbs waved from the station platform, his face split by a wide grin. Gustav the blacksmith stopped his hammering to raise a hand in salute. Even Jebediah Finch, the storekeeper, gave a jerky, nervous nod of respect from his doorway. The solid, irrefutable evidence presented in that Laramie courtroom had done more than free a man. It had broken the fever of fear and prejudice that had held the town captive. Most people respected proof, and most people respected the courage it had taken to get it. When they reached Willow Draw, the charred skeleton of the barn roof stood as a stark black wound against the melting snow. June, who had been quiet for the whole ride, ran from the wagon, not to Silas, her long-lost uncle, but to Abby. She launched herself into Abby's arms. Silas stopped, his hat in his hands, and watched the small girl cling to the woman who had, by all rights, been his intended. He looked at his brother, Eli, who stood beside Abby, his hand resting naturally on June's back. A complex mix of gratitude, loss, and profound understanding passed over Silas's face. He stepped forward, and the first person he spoke to was Abby. "Miss Quinn," he began, his voice rough. I owe you an apology. More than one. I wrote that letter asking you to come here, and I got you tangled in my own trouble. I sent the warning letter to Eli too late. I put you all in danger." Abby gently set June down. "You do not owe me anything. Silas, we are family." Silas looked at her strong, calm face, and then at his brother. He saw the way Eli looked at Abby, a quiet, steady warmth that had not been in his eyes for years. Silas smiled, a genuine sad and ultimately happy smile. He pulled his brother into a hard embrace. Then, turning back to Abby, he extended his hand, not as a suitor, but as a partner. "Welcome home, Abby, I promise. I will work hard to help you both keep it." The rebuilding of the barn began the very next morning. They were not alone. Just as the sun was clearing the horizon, a wagon rumbled up the track. It was Gustav, the blacksmith, with a load of new, cured lumber. He was followed by Samuel, the neighbor, who brought 2 more men and a box of nails. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered. Mr. Tibbs arrived, claiming he was there to supervise, but he immediately set to work sorting shingles. Martha Joy and 2 other women from the town's small church group arrived carrying enormous pots of hot stew, fresh bread, and a keg of coffee. They set up a makeshift kitchen near the cabin, and the sounds of hammering were soon joined by the sounds of laughter and chatter. It was not just a barn raising. It was a mending. It was the community, led by those who had chosen to speak the truth, physically demonstrating their choice to heal the wound Pike had left on the town. Abby found herself at the center of the domestic work. She organized the food, poured coffee, and when one of the younger hands missed a nail and struck his thumb, it was Abby he came to. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, applied a yarrow poultice to stop the bleeding, and wrapped it firmly with a clean strip of cloth, her movements quick and practiced. She was the mistress of the ranch in all but name, the healer, the center of its warmth. Eli and Silas worked shoulder to shoulder on the new roof, their hammers rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. They were rebuilding their home. That evening, the ranch was quiet. The neighbors were gone. June was asleep, worn out from a day of delivering water to the workers. Silas, claiming his old spot in the barn, had retired early, leaving Eli and Abby alone on the cabin porch. The air was sharp and cold, but the scent of fresh-cut pine from the new roof was the smell of progress, of a future. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky. Eli cleared his throat. He reached into his trousers pocket. He did not say her name. He simply held out his hand. In his rough, scarred palm lay a small, simple ring of silver. It was not new, but it was polished bright. Abby picked it up. In the faint starlight, she could see a delicate, repeating pattern etched into the metal. It was a spray of willow blossoms, the symbol of the ranch, the tree that bent but did not break. He spoke, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. I cannot promise you riches. Abby, I cannot promise you a life without hardship. This land is hard, and it does not give away its gifts for free. He turned to look at her, his gaze steady and deep. But I can promise to work alongside you. I can promise to listen to you, and to honor you, and to build a life with you. I can promise that you will never, ever be unwanted again. Abby felt the cool metal of the ring, a solid weight in her hand. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire inside. A slow smile touched her lips. She looked at him, her eyes shining with a familiar, gentle humor. This is a very serious contract, Mr. Reed. Eli's face was tense, waiting. I will have to consider it, she said, her voice teasing. But if you go inside right now and wash all the supper dishes, I will take it as a sign of good faith, and I will nod. Eli stared at her. The tension on his face broke, replaced by a slow, wide grin that lit up his entire face. He stood up and took the ring from her hand, sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. I will nod twice, he said. The following Sunday, the small church in Copper Butte was full. The preacher, the one who had once rung his bell to an empty street, stood before his congregation. He looked pale, but his voice was strong. He did not open his Bible right away. He looked at his people. He looked at Eli, Abby, Silas, and June, sitting in the third row. My friends, he began, I must make a confession. I have been a coward. I stood by in silence while prejudice and cruelty were spoken in my town. I was afraid. I was afraid of Baron Pike, afraid of losing my small church, afraid of losing your favor. And in my silence, I failed God, and I failed all of you. He took a deep breath. I want to publicly apologize to the Reed family, and especially to Miss Abigail Quinn. I allowed fear to rule me. He finally opened the good book. Today, he said, I will not speak of damnation. I will speak of justice, and I will speak of mercy, and how they must, in a God-fearing heart, always live together. It was a true healing. Later that week, as they were in the general store, Mr. Tibbs pulled Eli aside. A telegraph message had come through. It was from a marshal in Colorado. A man matching Luther Pike's description had been spotted crossing the border into the unorganized territory. He was gone, vanished into the lawless lands. The news was a small, cold stone in the warmth of their new life. The snake was still out there. But as Eli and Abby rode home, the worry seemed distant. Pike was a problem for another day. Today, they had a ranch to run. Life settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. The snow melted, revealing the first green shoots of spring grass. June blossomed. She followed Abby everywhere, a small, bright shadow. She learned the herbs, her small fingers sorting dried leaves. Abby found her one afternoon sitting by the new calves, patiently crafting a small medicine bag. She said it was to keep the bad spirits from their legs. She no longer asked if she could keep Abby. She simply called her Mommy, as if she had been doing it her entire life. One clear evening, as the sun was setting, Abby took Eli and June down to the creek. The water, swollen with melt, rushed over the stones. It was the place where Eli had almost been lost, the place where Abby had refused to let him go. She took a small bundle of dried sage from her pocket, a gift her mother had given her years ago. She lit it, and a plume of sharp, clean smoke rose into the still air. She fanned it with her hand, over June, over Eli, and over herself. She spoke quietly of her mother's people, of cleansing the past and making a home for the future. Eli watched her, his heart full. He understood. He bent down and picked up a smooth, gray stone from the creek bed, worn by the water. He held it in his hand, its weight a comfort. He spoke of his first wife, Sarah, of her Comanche people, and of the strength of the earth. He spoke of new beginnings. When they returned to the cabin, he placed the stone on the hearth. In the center of their home, a piece of the Cheyenne way, a piece of the Comanche way, and a piece of their new way, all resting together. That night, they sat on the porch, the new ring on Abby's finger catching the faint starlight. The night was quiet, peaceful, and then, from high up in the hills, a sound cut through the darkness. A long, clear, lonely howl of a wolf. It was a wild sound, a reminder of the vast, untamed land around them, a reminder that dangers were still out there. Abby shivered. Eli reached over and took her hand. His grip was warm, strong, and sure. He did not speak for a long time. The wolf howled again. Farther away this time. Home is not a place, Eli said quietly, his thumb rubbing the back of her hand. It is just when someone is holding your hand. Spring came to Wyoming territory not as a gentle guest, but as a hard-won victory. The snow, which had buried the world in a shroud of white, retreated slowly, grudgingly, revealing a land that was bruised but unbroken. On the high plains around Willow Draw, the first shoots of green grass pushed through the muddy earth with a fierce, determined life. The creek, which had been a torrent of meltwater, settled into a clear, steady murmur. The air lost its biting edge, replaced by the sweet, clean scent of damp soil and new growth. The ranch was healing, just as the land was. The new roof on the barn stood strong and true, the fresh pine boards already weathering to a soft silver. In the pastures, the calves born during the Great Norther, once so fragile, were now sturdy and rambunctious, their clumsy leaps a daily testament to survival. The small profit they made from the first cattle sale of the season was not a fortune, but it was a beginning. It was the fruit of their shared labor, a tangible sign that life was triumphing over the calculated cruelty that had sought to destroy them. They chose to be married on a Saturday in late May. There was no formal church service, no grand reception. They stood beneath the largest of the willow trees that gave the ranch its name, its long, graceful branches just beginning to show the pale green of new leaves. The tree had survived 100 winters, its roots deep in the earth, its branches flexible enough to bend in the harshest winds. It was a fitting altar. Their guests were not the whole of Copper Butte, but the whole of their new world. Gustav Schmidt, the blacksmith, stood tall and proud in a clean shirt, his gnarled hands scrubbed free of soot. Martha Joy was there, her children standing quietly beside her, her face free from the fear that had haunted it for so long. Mr. Tibbs, the station master, had closed the telegraph office for 2 hours to attend, an unprecedented event. Several women from the church group, the ones who had made stew and collected bail money, stood together, their presence a quiet, powerful statement of support. The preacher was there, not to preside over a religious rite, but to act as the legal officiant for a civil union, his humble presence a blessing in itself. Patrick Miles had ridden all the way from Laramie, his rumpled suit looking strangely at home under the wide Wyoming sky. Abby wore the same simple dress she had worn in the courtroom, but today it was not a uniform of defiance, but a garment of celebration. Her mother's beaded shawl was a cascade of color over her shoulders. She had woven a few of the early spring wildflowers into her dark hair. She was not a mail-order bride, a half-breed, an outsider. She was a woman standing in her own home, about to marry the man she had chosen. Eli stood beside her, his usual stern expression softened by a profound, unguarded happiness. He wore a clean work shirt and trousers, his boots polished, his hair slicked down with water. He looked solid, dependable, a man rooted to the land he stood on. June stood between them, holding both of their hands. She wore a new dress Martha Joy had sewn for her, and her flaxen hair was tied back with a blue ribbon. She looked up at Abby, her small face serious. Her blue eyes filled not with the fevered confusion of that first day, but with a clear, shining joy. The preacher read a few simple words about partnership and faith, but the real ceremony was quieter. June tugged on Abby's hand. Abby knelt down so they were face to face. "Can I keep you, Mommy?" June asked, her voice a happy, confident whisper that carried on the gentle breeze. This time, there was no question in it, no desperate plea. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of a truth that had become the bedrock of their lives. Abby's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. She cupped June's face in her hands. "You keep me, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick but steady. "Forever." She rose, and the preacher looked to Eli. The vows they had prepared were not flowery or poetic. They were promises forged in the hardships they had endured. Eli took Abby's hands in his. His voice was a low, steady rumble. "Abby," he said, "I promise I will never abandon you. I promise I will never again stand silent in the face of injustice. I promise to protect this family with my life and with my labor. I promise to be your home." Abby's grip on his hands tightened. Her voice was clear and strong. "Eli," she said, "I promise to be the healer of this house. I promise to stand beside you, not behind you. I promise to help you build a life that is good and just. I promise to be your partner in all things." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Eli did not kiss her with a grand, theatrical passion. He simply leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. A kiss that was a quiet seal on a sacred promise. The celebration that followed was held on long tables set up in the yard. The food was simple and plentiful. The laughter was loud and genuine. The centerpiece of the event was a mountain of Abby's biscuits, which had become legendary in the territory. June, taking her duties very seriously, appointed herself the official biscuit police. She marched from guest to guest, her hands on her hips. "Mr. Tibbs," she said sternly, "I only see one biscuit on your plate. The law requires two." The station master, playing along, raised his hands in mock surrender. "Guilty as charged. Officer, I will correct my error at once." The small game, so innocent and funny, was a powerful act of reclamation. It filled the air with laughter, erasing the ghosts of the jailhouse and the courtroom, replacing bad memories with a new, happy one. During the meal, two men from the town, ranchers who had once been openly hostile, approached the main table. They stood awkwardly, their hats in their hands, their faces a mixture of shame and respect. One of them, a man named Henderson, finally spoke. "Mrs. Reed," he said, stumbling over the new name, We wanted to apologize. We were wrong. We listened to Pike's poison, and we treated you poorly. We are sorry for it." Abby looked at the two men. She saw no triumph in their apology, only a shared humanity. She could have been bitter. She could have reminded them of their cruelty. Instead, she offered them grace. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. The past is the past. Doing good from today is enough for any of us." She offered them a plate of biscuits. They each took one, a silent communion of forgiveness, and retreated, their shoulders a little less slumped. Later. As the afternoon sun slanted low, Abby saw Eli and Silas standing by the newly repaired corral, deep in conversation. They were not just celebrating the present, they were planning the future. "We could do it," Silas was saying, his voice full of a new, constructive energy. "That watering station Pike wanted. We could build it ourselves, but we do it right. We draw up a fair contract with the railroad. We charge them a fair price, the money we make. We can use to help other ranchers. Maybe even start a small school for the children out here." Eli nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We can turn the weapon he tried to use against us into a tool for the whole community." It was the ultimate victory. Not just surviving Pike's scheme, but transforming it into something good. Before the light faded completely, Abby sat down in the quiet of the cabin. She took out a pen and fresh paper. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to Patrick Miles. She thanked him not just for his legal skill, but for his belief in them. The second was to Gustav Schmidt. She thanked him for his courage, for being an iron brand of a man. true and unbending. The letters were more than just notes of gratitude. They were the threads that stitched their small, brave network together. A promise of mutual support that would endure long after the wedding celebration had ended. Their family had not been born of blood or convenience. It had been chosen, forged in a blizzard, tested by fire, and finally, sealed by love. They had learned that honor was not about wealth or power, but about the simple, difficult act of standing with the weak against the strong. They had built a home, not just of logs and nails, but of courage and justice. As the last of their guests departed, their wagons rumbling away into the purple twilight, a lone rider approached at a gallop. It was the young telegraph operator from Laramie, a friend of Mr. Tibbs. He was waving a piece of paper. "A message for you, Mr. Reed," he said, breathless. "It just came over the wire, from the United States Marshal's office in Denver." Eli took the telegram. He unfolded it and read it by the light of the lantern hanging on the porch. His face was unreadable for a moment. Then, a slow, deep breath escaped him. He handed the paper to Abby. The message was short, the words stark and final. Luther Pike apprehended near Leadville. Wanted on federal charges of fraud related to railroad land grants. Case unrelated to Wyoming matter. Justice is forthcoming. Stop. A year passed. The spring of 1891 arrived like a promise kept. The land around Willow Draw was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of deep and abiding life. The ranch was now more than a ranch. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, the main room of the cabin was transformed. It became a schoolhouse. Abby, with Eli his help, had built 2 long plank tables and a set of benches. They opened their home to the children of the High Plains, the sons and daughters of ranchers and homesteaders who lived too far from the town. Abby taught letters and numbers, reading from a well-worn book of Shakespeare, his plays, and a thick book of household accounts. She believed practicality and poetry were necessary partners. But the most popular class was held in the afternoon. This was when she taught the herbs. She showed them how to identify yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for fever, and mint for an upset stomach. Her assistant in this was June. Now 6 years old, June was a small, solemn expert. She would hold up a dried plant, her voice piping and clear. "This is chamomile. It is for sleeping." And for grumpy uncles. Silas, who was often nearby mending harnesses, would look up and pretend to scowl, which always made the children laugh. The cabin, once a place of tense, quiet survival, was now filled with the sound of children, their voices. The story of the Laramie trial had traveled. It had moved along the telegraph wires and in the saddlebags of itinerant preachers and traveling merchants. It had become a kind of legend. The story of the small ranch that had faced down Barren Pike and won, not with bullets, but with truth. Letters began to arrive at Willow Draw. They came from families in Nebraska, in the Colorado Territory, in places Abby had never seen. These letters were written on rough paper, the words spelled out with labor and fear. They told familiar stories. A land baron, a railroad spur, a false accusation, a sheriff who looked the other way. They were not asking for a lawyer. They were asking for advice, for courage. Eli and Abby would read them at night by the fire. Eli would dictate a response, his words slow and measured. He spoke of the iron brand, of checking the ledgers, of finding the hobnail tracks. He spoke of talking to neighbors, of building a network of honest men. Abby would write, her penmanship clear and strong. She would add a postscript of her own. She spoke of courage. She wrote that fear is a shadow, and the only way to make it shrink is to walk directly toward it. She told them they were not alone. Their small fight in Copper Butte had started a network, a quiet alliance of the decent. The ranch was thriving. The watering station they had built for the railroad, on their own fair terms, had brought a steady, honest income. They had to hire 2 new hands to help manage the growing herd. Silas and Eli interviewed the men in the yard. Silas asked about their experience with calving and long drives. Eli, standing on the porch, his arms crossed, just watched. Later, Abby asked him what he looked for. "Silas handles the cattle part," Eli said, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I have new standards. I need to know 2 things. Can he set a fence post straight in frozen ground? And can he eat 3 of your biscuits in one sitting without fainting from joy?" Abby swatted his arm. "That is a terrible standard." "It is the most important one," Eli insisted, his eyes twinkling. "It proves he has good sense and a strong constitution." That night, Abby prepared for bed. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders. She looked at her small corner of the cabin, which was now truly hers. On a hook on the wall, her mother, his Cheyenne shawl, with its intricate patterns of blue and white beads, hung next to the simple silver ring with the willow blossom engraving, which she placed on the hook only when she was washing. She looked at the 2 objects, side by side. One was the legacy of her mother, a story of a proud people, of the plains, of herbs, of a world that was fading. The other was the legacy of her new life, of a man, a child, a home built by a creek, of a love that was growing. They were not 2 things at war. They were 2 rivers, 2 bloodlines that had finally found a place to meet. They were 2 streams flowing together, watering the same soil, and in that confluence, her life had finally taken root. She sat on the edge of the bed, the rough wool of the blanket familiar beneath her hands. She thought back to that first day, to the biting wind and the impossible, soul-crushing cold of the Copper Butte station. She remembered the feeling of being utterly alone, discarded, a piece of unwanted freight at the end of the line. She had arrived with 67 cents and a photograph of a man who was not there. She looked across the room. Eli was sitting at the table, his head bent over the ranch ledger, the firelight catching the gray at his temples. He was a good man, a quiet man, a man who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. He had not saved her. They had saved each other. Her life here was not an easy one. The wind still howled, the winters were still brutal, but she was no longer unwanted. She was chosen. She was chosen every day, in the small, quiet ways that mattered more than any grand declaration. She was chosen when Eli brought her a cup of coffee in the morning. She was chosen when June ran to her with a skinned knee. And she chose them back. With every biscuit she baked, every lesson she taught, every stitch she sewed. The trial felt like a lifetime ago. They had won. They had found justice. But Abby had come to understand that justice was not a single, dramatic event held in a polished courtroom. It was not a verdict from a judge. Justice was a daily practice. It was Gustav the blacksmith giving a fair price to a poor homesteader. It was Martha Joy reading a letter for a neighbor who could not read himself. It was Eli paying his new hands a decent wage, and Silas taking the time to teach them. It was the way the town of Copper Butte was slowly, painfully, changing. The whispers had not stopped entirely, but their nature had changed. People still talked about the woman at Willow Draw, but they no longer spoke of her mixed heritage with scorn. They spoke of her medicines. They spoke of the school. When she came to town, Jebediah Finch, the storekeeper, would tip his hat and ask after her health. The men in the saloon, the same ones who had once jeered, now fell silent with a grudging, deep respect. The town had learned that courage and kindness could come in a form they had not expected. They had learned that what a person did was more important than who they had been born. The cabin was quiet. The fire crackled, a low, comfortable sound. Abby placed a hand on her own stomach, a small, secret smile on her face. It was a change she had felt for weeks, a new, gentle unfolding within her, a tiny flicker of life that was not yet a certainty, but a profound hope. Eli looked up from his ledger, his gaze meeting hers across the room. He saw the look on her face, the hand held protectively. His own expression softened. A slow, wondering dawn of understanding. He set down his pen and crossed the room. He knelt before her, his large, rough hand covering hers. He did not speak. He just rested his hand there. A silent question, a silent promise. June, woken by the sudden quiet, padded over from her small bed, rubbing her eyes. "What are you doing?" Eli smiled, pulling his daughter close. "We are listening." June pressed her small ear against Abby, his stomach, right next to her father. Her face was a mask of concentration. "I hear a heart," June whispered, her eyes wide with awe. "Like a new calf, only faster." The next evening, Abby stood on the porch, watching the sun go down. The sky was a riot of color, orange and purple and a deep, bruised red, bleeding out over the western hills. The wind, her old enemy, was a gentle breeze tonight. It moved through the tall spring grass, making it rise and fall in long, slow waves, like an endless green ocean. Eli came to stand beside her, his arms slipping around her waist, pulling her close against his solid warmth. June stood on her other side, her small hand tucked firmly into Abby his. They stood together, the three of them, a family forged not by blood, but by choice. Abby looked at the vast, beautiful, dangerous land. She looked at the man beside her and the child holding her hand. Home, finally, forever. In the windswept land, some homes are not built of brick and stone, but of courage, justice, and the love that chooses them. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to support us so this story can be heard by more people.